if you were following in the Etz Chaim Chumash, we're on page 432. This is, well, they're all good, but this is a particularly good parsha. This is particularly profound because this is the parsha where we have Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, and the Ten Commandments. And it's it doesn't start with that though. It starts with something that feels slightly more mundane, which is Moses dealing with childcare issues. Moses, like so many of us, not quite sure what to do with his kids during a dangerous time. And so we didn't know this already, but the text comes to tell us that Moses had placed his sons and his wife in the care of his father-in-law during the events of the Exodus from Egypt. You look on page 432, Jethro, priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out from Egypt. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she had been sent home, and her two sons. So that's probably the end of that particular clause. And now we're going to sort of interrupt that clause with an explanation of the sons, who we haven't met before. We haven't encountered these children of Moses, except in the most sort of roundabout way when Moses was first going into Egypt, and there's this very strange bit with circumcision. But now we're sort of being reintroduced to the boys, and so we're being told their names and how they got their names. So there are two sons, one of whom was named Gershom. That is to say, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. So the word ger can mean stranger or sojourner or something like that. And some people think that the joke or the pun that's being made here is based on Gershom, that he is a stranger there. When we see the same thing in the book of Judges with one of the judges who is named Shamgar. So Shamgar, Gershom, it's all similar sort of pieces. And this is one of Moses' sons. And then the other one is named Eliezer, meaning God of my father was my help, and he delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. So if you want to read that the way the translators have it here, as in the past tense, Moses appears to be naming Eliezer after his personal escape. That Eliezer, Ezer means help, and El means God. So my God is help, is what Eliezer means. And so the question is, what's the help? Where's the help? When was the help? And if this is personal, then Moses is naming him after probably the time he escaped, after he had killed the Egyptian taskmaster and ran away. So probably that's the occasion for the name here. When else would Moses have been delivered from the sword of Pharaoh? Unless you want to say that this is actually, it ought to be read in the future tense. And Hebrew is a little bit tricky about that sometimes. Not really modern Hebrew so much, but biblical Hebrew. The past tense and the future tense get very mixed up with each other. It can be very hard to tell which is which sometimes. And so it could be that this is Moses speaking with a prophetic voice about the deliverance that the Jewish people will have from the sword of Pharaoh. So, couple of options there. I'm not sure there's really one way to pin them down, but it's interesting nonetheless. We'll keep going here. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moses' sons and wife to him in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her two sons. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. He bowed low and kissed him. Each asked after the other's welfare, and they went into the tent. So this is a nice moment. This is a beautiful moment. Jethro is not present for the miracles. He is not around for the splitting of the sea. And depending on how you do the chronology, I think the text is strongly implying that he's not there for the giving of the Torah either. But he kind of pops in between the two miracles. And the question is why? Why is he appears to be a righteous man. He appears to be a godly man, and yet he's not mixed up in the action. He's not someone who's personally present for either of these great national moments for Israel. Many have speculated that it is about the national character of these miracles, that to be present, to be involved in these miracles makes you part of Israel. It makes you Jewish, essentially. That what's going on here is in many ways the emergence of a new people, a new nation, and to go through that means you are in the mix. You are one of the people. And Jethro is not. He has his people. He has his family. He has his land. And he is going home. He is headed home, and in this conception of things, Jethro becomes the sort of paradigm of the righteous Gentile. He is someone who believes in God. He is someone who's rejected idolatry. He follows the 7 mitzvot of Noah, but he is not interested in taking it to the same level as the Jewish people. He's not interested in joining the Jewish covenant with all of its attendant responsibilities, but he's going to walk on his own righteous path while remaining outside of the particulars of our covenant. That's a way to read it, and many have. Many have read it totally differently. Many have said, in fact, Jethro does convert to Judaism. In fact, Jethro is the sort of the paradigm of the righteous convert, in that he isn't present. This is something Reish Lakish writes about in the Talmud, that we have this idea that everyone is present at Mount Sinai, and that the souls of the people who aren't born yet are present at Mount Sinai. You may have heard this before, that every one of us was at Mount Sinai. But it's sort of one thing to be there in your spiritual form. It's another thing to physically be there, to have the thunder ring in your eardrums. And Reish Lakish says that those who weren't there to witness the miracle and yet accept the covenant anyway are more righteous than those who accepted the covenant after they were impressed with the sound and light show at Mount Sinai. It's not me saying it; it's Reish Lakish saying it. And so this is Jethro sort of standing in as as sort of the symbolic person who comes in, the symbolic person who shows up and joins in. And that may be what it means here. Each asked after the other's welfare, and they went into the tent. You can have some fun with that if you're so inclined to say, what were they doing in there? Well, they were studying Torah, and they were maybe Jethro was going in front of the Beit Din. It's entirely possible. You don't have to read it that way, but you certainly can. So Moses then recounted to his father-in-law everything that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and all the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that had befallen them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced over all the kindness that the Lord had showed Israel when he delivered them from the Egyptians. Let's pause there for a second just to note a bit of a contrast here between verse 1 and verse 8. So in verse 1, it says, Jethro had heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, how the Lord had brought Israel out from Egypt. And then in verse 8, it says Moses told him the whole story. So Moses is telling Jethro a story that he already knows. Moses is telling Jethro a story he's already heard. I think we've all been in that situation, right? Someone's trying to explain something to us, and it's something that we're already pretty familiar with. And you can read it as sort of humoring him or being patient with him, and he's just sort of silently waiting there, saying, "Yes, Jethro, I know this already. Thank you for sharing." But I think there is actually something more spiritually profound going on here, where Moses is telling Jethro the story from his point of view. Jethro knows the outline of what happened, but he's hearing it from Moses's perspective. He's hearing Moses's point of view. A lot of us do this when we're trying to sort of psychologically compartmentalize the big tragic moments of our lives. People used to talk about where they were when they heard that Kennedy was assassinated, or people talk about where they were on 9/11. And I could tell you my story where I was. It's not actually a good story. It's not an interesting story. I was in Iowa and nothing happened. That's the sort of bottom line of my story. But the reason we tell these stories to each other is to, like I say, it's to compartmentalize the story that's just too big. It's the story that's too big for us. We don't have room to explain our own story in the midst of these enormous stories, and it can be very useful to do that. It can be very helpful psychologically to place yourself in the context of something bigger, even when it's in some people's case not a particularly gripping story. Now Moses's version of the Exodus, I imagine, was a pretty good version, so that's a story worth listening to. I see a couple of hands up. Joanna, you were first, then David.
I would think too that when you know somebody who actually was there firsthand, and Moses not only was firsthand, but he had a lot of role in this. You do want to hear from that person to really you have the perception that is closer to the truth than what you might have heard from a passing caravan. That's kind of what I imagine Jethro did. So. And also from a spiritual point of view, I think when you point that out, it transfers the spirituality to him, to Jethro at that time. Again, it's hard to get the nuts of the real essence of it from somebody who just is telling the story. But in this case, it seems like there was this transference to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I would definitely want to hear Moses's version of the story if he were around to talk. That sounds pretty cool, actually. Yeah, David.
I had the same point. Hearsay versus firsthand, not only firsthand, but Moses.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's take a look here. This next verse is a very important one because Jethro is responding to Moses's story. He's responding to the story of the Exodus. In verse 10, he says, "Blessed be the Lord," Jethro said, "who delivered you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians." And so if you look in the Hebrew here, Avayome Yitro Baruch Hashem Asher Hitzil Etchem Miyad Mitzrayim. So this is, for those who are keeping track of this sort of thing, the first time we see the expression Baruch Hashem. And this is one of the only times that we get something approaching our bracha construction. The Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam. It shows up in the book of Psalms, and it shows up in the book of Chronicles, and those are our sources for that particular construction. But we get close in a couple of places. This is one of them, and Genesis 14 is another one of them. And in both cases, this is spoken by someone who is not well, I'll try to say it a little smaller. In both cases, it's spoken by someone who does not appear to be fully in the covenant. Someone who is not Jewish, perhaps. Again, with Jethro, it's complicated and confusing. Is he Jewish? Is he not Jewish? But he's definitely not a biological child of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in Genesis 14, it is Melchizedek or Melchizedek in weird English. This is the king priest of Shalem, which is probably Jerusalem. And the Midrash says that Melchizedek is actually Shem, the son of Noah. Whether you want to take that at face value or not, I will leave up to you. But he's definitely not someone who's sort of in the mainstream of the covenantal story. But in both of these cases, we have people coming from the outside who establish this expression, this concept of saying Baruch Hashem, Baruch Adonai, blessed be the Lord. And it's in many ways an absolutely fundamental expression, but here it's sort of it's written around, it's constructed around specificities. So blessed be the Lord who did these things. Blessed be the Lord who works in our lives. It's not an abstraction. It's not the Platonic ideal of God, the unmoved mover, the first cause. This is God in relationship. This is God wanting something, changing the world on our behalf. This is God loving and working in the world. And that is the Lord that we bless here. All right, we'll go on here. So in verse 11, Jethro says, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. Yes, by the result of their very schemes against the people." And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to partake of the meal before God with Moses' father-in-law. Well, I could do a class just on that. Just those few verses, we could talk for more than an hour. There is so much going on there. What does Jethro mean? What does Yitro mean here when he says, "Now that I know"? The Hebrew is basically the same as the English. You don't really glean that much through a look at the Hebrew. But "Ata yadati ki gadol Adonai mikol ha'elohim," that the Lord is greater than all the gods.
Where's the word yes? I don't see Ken in there.
Ken is not a biblical Hebrew word for
Okay,
yes.
so I'm sorry. So what is the biblical Hebrew word there?
There is no biblical Hebrew word for yes.
So it says, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods." Yes. By the result, why did they add the yes? Was my question.
That's a great question, and yeah, no, it's. I'm not sure.
That's what I was
I probably
wondering
wouldn't
about.
have added that yes. The way you say yes in biblical Hebrew is to affirm the verb of the question that someone's asking you. So if I'm asking, "Hey, did you shovel the driveway?" then the response would be "shoveled," and that means yes. So that's how they did yes back then. Yes is actually one of the later words to develop in a lot of languages. There's no Latin for yes, not in classical Latin. So I'm looking here to see where they would have gotten that.
It's okay. It stood out to me as being odd when you said there's
It
no
is
difference between the English
yeah.
and the Hebrew. That's what I noticed. So anyway, there's a lot of unusual translations. I just was assuming I screwed up and didn't see it.
I probably would have translated this without the yes. Now I know the Lord is greater than all the gods by the result of their very schemes.
Yeah.
That's really against them is what it says. It doesn't say against the people. It says against them. But they're translating it here as though this is the schemes of the gods against the Jewish people. And that's a fine explanation. That's probably what it is. But it's interesting here what Jethro isn't saying. He isn't saying there is only one God in heaven. You do actually see this if you look in 1 Kings chapter 6, or 2 Kings chapter 6 rather. There is a man named Naaman who is a Assyrian, not Assyrian. He's how do you say Aramean? He's an Aramean general. He's an Aramean general who's got a terrible skin condition, and he is actually in his. He's a wealthy man. He has a number of slaves, and one of them is a woman from Israel who was captured as a result of war a long time ago, and she mentions to him that that there are prophets in Israel who can help with these skin conditions. And so Naaman, he goes and he meets with the prophet Elisha, and Elisha tells him to bathe in the Jordan River. And he's a little incredulous because the Jordan River, if you've ever seen it, is not especially impressive. Then there are much bigger rivers where he's from in modern Syria, and he's right about that. There are much bigger rivers, but he does it anyway, and it cures his skin disease. At which point he begins expounding on how there is only one God, and the God of Israel is the creator of heaven and earth, and he's never going to worship another God ever again. He might have to pretend to as part of his job. When the king bows low in front of the idol, he might have to bow low in order to help the king stand up. But he's not actually worshiping God. And by the way, can I go home with a little bit of dirt from Israel so that wherever I'm praying, I'm standing on the land of Israel, which is it's very nice. But so that's probably the strongest statement of monotheism made by a person anywhere in the Bible. We have sort of equally strong statements made by the prophets, such as Isaiah, but in the narrative section, that's as strong as it gets. And Jethro here isn't nearly that strong. He's saying the God of Israel is greater than all the other gods. Well, yeah, okay. So that's what are you saying there when you're saying the God of Israel is greater than all the other gods? The other gods exist. They are gods. They have power. They just don't, they're just not the best. They're just not the top dogs. And so, what does that imply in terms of a relationship with God? Hard to say. Hard to say what that means exactly. If you posit that there's one big God and lots of little gods, would you then say, I should mostly worship the big God and only worship the little God occasionally? Or I should only worship the big God and ignore all the little gods? You can make a case either way. The text doesn't make that case for us, really. This is what scholars, by the way, call henotheism. It's not quite monotheism. It's close, but you're not really 100% of the way there.
Can you say that word again?
Henotheism.
H-E-N?
Yeah, H-E-N-O. It's a term really mostly only used by biblical scholars to describe this this very section and others where it seems like God is the best of many. You see this in Psalm 96, which we sing on Shabbat, on Kabbalat Shabbat, where we say that God is greater than all the other gods. And then the very next verse sort of comes to clarify, by the way, all the other gods aren't actually gods. just in case you were confused by our previous statement that God is greater than the other gods.
But we say mi chamocha all the time, and
right, absolutely.
alim.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're constantly saying who you're so much greater than all the other gods, but implicit is that notion. So
yeah, oh, absolutely.
Without any explanation. So
and in the Psalms also speaks of God ruling over the assembly of the gods. And we see this sort of language pop up a lot. The Deir Allah inscription in Jordan, which is sadly lost, but we do have a copy of it preserved before it fell apart upon contact with oxygen in the sand, in the dirt for centuries, and survived in the dirt. And then the moment they excavated it, it started falling apart. But we got some pictures of it, and it speaks of Bilam, the prophet we know from the book of Numbers. And Bilam is involved in worship and magic, and he's doing it on behalf of what's called the Shaddayim. And the Shaddayim appear to be something akin to a pantheon. It's like Mount Olympus, where all the gods are sort of together. And we see a sort of remnant of that in the book of Psalms, where we have the Adat El, the assembly of the gods. It takes a while to sort of move past some of this stuff, and this is something that scholars spent a lot of time arguing about. Can you say? I mean, first of all, you have to assume that monotheism is better than polytheism, which is a big if, right? I mean, I assume that because I'm a rabbi, but from a scholarly perspective, it's a bit of a self-serving leap for monotheistic scholars to say, well, we used to be savage polytheists, and then we learned better, then we figured it out. But that was the assumption made by biblical scholars in the earliest days of scholarship in the 19th century. They saw the move from polytheism to monotheism as a sort of step-by-step journey. And this was one of those steps. This was on the way to a pure monotheism. We have this henotheism, where you have God is the greatest of all of the other gods, but they continue to exist. You see this in Parashat Ha'azinu, where there seems to be some reference to every country, every nation has its God, and ours is the best, though. Ours is the one who we are ruled directly by the God who made heaven and earth. All the other nations are ruled by a smaller God made by our God. That appears to be the direction that the text is hinting at, and obviously this is going to be problematic from a rabbinic point of view. And later Jews, not even that much later, probably in the Persian era, you see this sort of talk of gods being shifted over into angels. And so at this point, every country gets its guardian angel. And when God is speaking in the garden before the creation story and says, "Let us make man in our image," he's talking to the angels. And angels become very, very useful to sort of clear up some of these literary problems where there's remnants of polytheism.
So angels are not deities,
right?
But there's something else. But in a henotheistic way, they sort of replaced that. Is what you're saying? I mean, God is speaking in the plural at creation, Elohim, and we're not sure who we just talked to. And then I wonder, are the saints and things like that in Christianity, like in Catholicism, are they sort of a form of, instead of being, I mean, they're saints instead of being angels, but people pray through them, like as a deity too, but they believe in a supreme deity. Is that what this is?
Right. Yeah, I mean,
even in the Bible, like, magical people like Balaam, like you said.
Right. If we had a Catholic priest in this conversation, they might, he might give us a different answer, a sort of pious answer. And there's always the pious answer when you're talking religion, and then there's the more sort of academic sociological answer. And the academic answer is that we know 100% beyond any shadow of a doubt that there were pagan gods whose stories and myths became the stories and myths of saints. Whether it's Saint Bride or Saint Bridget in Ireland, or Saint George in England, or the adoration of the Virgin Mary in Ephesus in modern Turkey. There are a vast number of places where the sort of the old stories, the polytheistic stories, get subsumed into the stories of the saints. Some people even think Saint Nicholas, the Santa Claus, has sort of hints of Odin about him. That there is something about the Germanic god who's all seeing and all knowing, becomes that lovable man in the red suit who sees you when you're sleeping and knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. Anything's possible, right? I'm not gonna stake any scholastic reputation on this, but it's possible. It very well could be. I do want to hit just one final point here in verse 12, which is that the text is very specific here, that when Jethro offers this sacrifice to the Lord, that Aaron comes and all the elders of Israel, they come and they eat it. They partake of the meal. They eat Jethro's offering. They eat Jethro's sacrifice. Now, this is a little anachronistic, but from a rabbinic point of view, this stands as pretty firm evidence that Jethro must have converted to Judaism, because that is the only way that that you can eat meat. It's the only way that meat can be kosher slaughtered. Someone who is not Jewish, they could do and follow exactly all of the rituals of kosher slaughter, but it doesn't make it kosher, because you have to be Jewish in order to do kosher slaughter. So for Aaron and the elders of Israel to eat this, presumably Jethro is fully in the covenantal experience. Now, like I say, this is a later reading, a sort of anachronistic reading. It's and if you want to sort of find a little micro argument against it, you could say, well, this is before Matan Torah, this is before the giving of the Torah, so the details of kosher slaughter haven't been introduced yet. There is some conversation that the children of Israel at this moment aren't keeping a lot of mitzvahs. Actually, they don't know them. Why would they? The Torah hasn't been given yet. The surprising story is the one that says, oh, they did know them. And you find some of those as well. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are supposed to have known the Torah even before it was given. But we already saw Moses didn't circumcise his sons. And so there is some evidence that no one's following the details of the Torah. But even if you're not going to follow the details of kosher slaughter, you might have imagined that Moses and Aaron and the elders of Israel aren't going to eat an offering made to God by a non-Jewish priest who believes in lots of gods. It points to an affirmation of what Jethro is saying here. Everything Yitro has said and done has been affirmed by the fact that Moses and Aaron and the elders, they're with him. They take part in the sacrifice. They have a role in the sacrifice, and they eat it. They eat the meal afterwards. So it's interesting. All right. Any thoughts about any of this? Comments, questions, concerns? I didn't think we were going to get this far, but we got to the end of the first Aliyah, and I think that's probably a good place to wrap this up. And we'll get we'll get to the next one. Oh, Robert, yeah, I see your hand.
No, I'm saying goodbye.
Oh, okay.
No,
All right.
I'm
fair
saying
enough.
goodbye. Thank you so much.
Is
Thank
an
you.
ola, the type of sacrifice that is completely burned?
Yes.
So, was this an ola sacrifice? Because I hear,
Let's see here.
I'm reading from the.
Yeah. Vayikach Yitro Choten Moshe Ola Uzvachim. So he made an ola and a zevach. So
Oh.
that would be the one that people could eat. Would be the zevach.
Oh, okay. That's what I was trying to know. Okay.
Yasher koach. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Shavua tov.